Good morning, everyone. My name is Frank Milone. I'm one of the founding partners at FML. Thank you so much for joining our webinar. We're going to give it a couple of minutes as we have a number of people that are still jumping into the webinar. So I'll make a couple of announcements. For those of you that are new to the Teams platform, there is a Q&A section where you can ask questions to the presenters. We'll do our best to be able to respond to those during the presentation. If we don't get to all the questions, we do our very best to get a published question and answer sheet out to all the participants after the event is over. We also will do our best if there are a couple of questions that come in a manner that are consistent on topics. I will throw those questions into the group, and if we have time, we'll debate those and give answers verbally on the presentation today. So don't be afraid to ask questions, and if our presenters don't get to them today, we'll be sure to reach out. So again, we're going to give it a couple of more minutes for those of you that are still trying to get into the webinar, and then we'll start momentarily. Good morning, everyone. Just a reminder, we're waiting a couple of minutes as we still have a number of participants that are joining the webinar. If you give me a couple of minutes, I'll introduce the presenters and we'll get going momentarily. Hello, everyone. We're still sitting. We're going to start momentarily. We are waiting on a number of participants to join the webinar. I want to give them a couple more minutes to join. It's a relatively new platform for some folks. I want to give them the ability to log in, and we will get going. Do our best to keep it to an hour. If we do run over, and you're willing to stay, please do. We do our best to answer as many questions as possible on the webinar. Obviously, if you have a time constraint, you can leave at noon. And again, we'll get the slides out as quickly as possible to everybody attending. And then we'll also go through a process of trying to answer any of the questions that we don't get to today's webinar. I'm going to give it another 30 seconds or so, and then I'm going to start the process. So thanks for your patience. All right, I think I'm going to get going. Thank you and good morning, everyone. Thanks for taking the time this morning to attend our webinar, not-for-profit focused, relating to the Paycheck Protection Program and what's next. My name is Frank Milone. I'm one of the founding partners of FML. Just a brief summary of FML for those of you who may not be familiar. We are a full-service accounting firm headquartered in Glastonbury, Connecticut. We have a fully staffed office out in Enfield, Connecticut, and we also have satellite offices throughout the state, including in New Haven and in Stamford, Connecticut. We are approximately 80 plus people, and look forward to getting to know each and every one of you. We have a COVID task force that we've established within the firm when this pandemic ended up impacting most of our clients, and we also have a dedicated page on our website that is constantly being updated for guidance relating to the CARES Act and the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, And I welcome and encourage everybody to go onto the website to understand different topics and how we approach those topics with our clients. Today, I have two members of the COVID task force that are with me today and will be doing the majority of the presenting. I'll let both of those individuals introduce themselves. We have Amber Tucker, who's a director in our audit practice, and we have Bill Claffey, who's a partner in our tax practice. So without any further ado, I will kick it over to Amber Tucker and allow her to introduce herself and get the program going. Thanks very much.
Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I have been with FML for about 2.5 years, but have been working with nonprofits for 15 years, focusing on those in the social service arena, arts and museums, membership-based organizations, and other kinds of nonprofits. So as Frank mentioned, I am on our COVID task force, and my purpose really on being on that task force is to keep up to date with the COVID items. But we have Bill here today because he is specifically keeping in touch with all those items, and I'm adding the nonprofit flavor to it. So while, as you know, we are unique to other small businesses, I want to make sure that we focus today on what those uniquenesses are and what differences are that you need to pay attention as you move forward into the next steps. So with that, I'm going to have Bill introduce himself.
Thanks, Amber. So if any of you folks have been with us for the last few weeks, we've given a number of webinars on the topic, all topics related to COVID-19 legislation, but there's clearly been a very large focus on the Paycheck Protection Program. Our previous webinars had focused more on who's eligible and kind of calculating your costs and understanding the forgiveness to a degree. And today's focus is going to be primarily on, most folks have either gotten their loan or they're in round 2, which opened up today, but they've gotten their loans or their loans have been approved and they're awaiting funds. And so now they're, we're getting a lot of questions as to, okay, what do I do now? And so this is meant to address that. There's going to be a lot of carryover material from other webinars, but like Amber mentioned, we're going to try and find those, pick and choose those spots where it's going to be specific to nonprofits. So just a quick background on myself. As Frank mentioned, I'm a partner on the tax side. I'm an attorney by trade, so I focus a lot on tax policy and procedure items and tax controversy items. And so when we were putting together our task force and we were trying to get different inputs and different areas of focus, my background was a component of our task force that we thought that was important as we were looking through the legislation. So we're going to kick off here. The first couple slides, we just wanted to get some loan statistics out. These are a little bit aged. They go back to, I believe, February 13th. But on the published data that we saw, obviously the 350 billion has been approved. The 310 billion has been enacted and approved, and that's going into round 2, which opened up today. But there are a lot of banks involved. It's probably over this number, 4,900. But I know a lot of folks early on had relationships with their institutions, and some were getting denied with lenders that they had used for many years. And so just know that if you kind of ran into that wall or you ran into some issues with your existing bank or some of the larger banks, that there are a lot of banks that have been approved to provide this SBA lending. If you go on the SBA website, they actually have a link into every approved lender. So if you're having trouble, I recommend you go to the SBA website and find that link, because we have a lot of clients that have had, like I said, had issues or problems with their existing bank, and then they found a smaller local bank and had great success with them. Again, probably a little bit aged, but Connecticut had received approximately $3 billion in approved loans. And then I mark here the 30 billion going to healthcare and social assistance. That's on our next slide. So if you want to forward that, Frank. Just again, I just thought this was interesting. You can see where the loan proceeds had gone as of February 13th. It's probably a little bit more than 2/3 of the loan proceeds, but you'll see there where the healthcare and social assistance, where I'm sure a lot of you folks kind of fell into, where you stand with regard to some of the other industries in our markets. Looks like those loans are about where the average was at 239. So just anyway, just an interesting stat. I'm sure that'll be updated, and we'll see where that kind of stands after round 2. Next two slides here. Just wanted to go into a little bit more detail so that you understand. We worked with a lot of clients, worked with our own PPP loan application, and everybody had a different experience with the bank. With their bank early on, a lot of the banks were providing a lot of information. I would say very little of it was consistent with one another. Everything from the application to what documentation was required to what information they wanted from any potential owners. You may have run into your own snags with information they wanted from a nonprofit perspective, but just understand this: the banks are they're held harmless, and that their requirement for due diligence on the loan application, and then we'll get into on the next slide on the loan forgiveness, is pretty limited. They're only required to look at your calculation and do a good faith review, and they have had thousands of applications, so I don't know what time parameters they had to do that good faith review, and then make sure that you provide a checklist of documentation both on the approval side, and then on the next slide there we'll get into just real briefly on the forgiveness slide. And I just want you to focus in on a couple points here. So they do not need to do an independent calculation on your forgiveness. So we're going to go through how do you get from you got the money today, and how do you get to the end of the 8-week period, and what kind of documentation is going to be required. But as they're going through their loan forgiveness approval process, they only really have to do a kind of a check the box on your documentation, and then as long as the business or the nonprofit attests that the calculations are accurate, that's enough to hold them harmless. And so we think, and again, this is an opinion, but we think that while many folks may get approved and then go through their 8-week cycle and get loan forgiveness with maybe not too many hurdles, that the SBA is going to come in for round 2. And that's where kind of the more in-depth calculations are going to occur. So we can go to the next slide there. So we tried to organize this in a way that helps you to think about all the different things that you need to think about as you're going through this next 8-week process and beyond. And so we've put it forth there. I mean, really understanding the law. We're going to go through a lot of those concepts. A lot of folks have read them, may understand them thoroughly. I don't know that anyone's been more plugged into this than myself, and I still don't know if I understand it fully. But we're going to do our best to keep you up to date. Understand that the regulations are changing almost daily. There have been gaps, but Friday night and Monday were pretty active days from within the SBA. And so making sure that you're up to date with everything, because they've shown that they're willing to put forth some new guidance and apply it retroactively. So understanding that, understanding timing and key dates, and we're going to go through those. It's very critical as you go through your analysis that you understand how the dates impact your loan and your business. And then you understand your fact pattern. I'm going to rely on Amber for a lot of that with regard to specific nonprofit fact patterns that may be relevant, and then modeling out the loan use and forgiveness. So and then going forth from there, documentation. We're going to cover all that in our presentation today, and that goes hand in hand with creating your audit proof submission. And we highly recommend that you, as you're going through that you do that you create your loan forgiveness calculation, that you gather all the documentation that's either required under SBA regulation, or we're going to discuss a little bit about what we recommend that you do during this process. But you create, so that this thing may not get audited. You may get an approval or a forgiveness approval in the near term, but it could get audited. And we don't have a statute of limitations deadline that's been published by the SBA, but you could be looking out, several years even as to whether the SBA could take a look at that. Okay, moving on to understanding the law. So most of you folks know this, but we put in both the eligible PPP uses, and then the eligible PPP forgiveness amounts, so that you understand that what's included. And the bullets there in red, although eligible uses of a PPP loan, and don't forget that PPP loan has a 2-year maturity and a 1% interest rate, but that there are eligible uses on that loan that are not forgivable. So you need to make sure that as you're planning out your strategy for purposes of using the PPP loan, that if you're trying to maximize forgiveness, you focus on the 4 bullets up top there, which are payroll costs. We're going to get into some more detail on what's included there. Your rent and lease payments, make sure that, and that's for real and tangible property. I think a lot of folks, initially thought that that may only be related to their building. But if you have any leases of any vehicles or any other major pieces of equipment, that could apply to you. Your utility payments, and I've documented there what that extends to. So obviously your electricity, gas, water, transportation, that hasn't really been well defined. But then telephone and internet access, we've gotten a lot of questions about, if we're reimbursing cell phone costs, would that qualify as an eligible use and then as a forgivable cost? Our belief is that it should, and it will, beyond your normal landline telephone lines. But that's the position we think is reasonable given today's world, where a lot of folks are obviously using cell phones and getting reimbursed for their cell phones. Internet access, we've gotten some questions on that, with regard to if we are paying a vendor for cloud storage, whether that's included in internet access. I don't have an answer for that, Frank or Amber. I don't know if you guys have seen anything on that, but as of this point, I would say that's probably a prohibited cost, and I think it would be limited to just your pure internet access fees. And then your mortgage interest payments. So, and then I put in bold there, does not include any kind of prepayment. And this is going to be a concept that we're going to go through as we walk through this today. But make sure as you're looking at this loan and how you're going to use it, that it is there to maintain ongoing operations and retain payroll. It's not there to expand payroll. It's not there to expand your operation. So we've gotten a lot of questions on, can I prepay rent? Can I prepay certain payments, utility payments, et cetera? No official guidance has been provided, but my thought on that is that would be likely denied by the SBA, because they're going to look back at those good faith certifications.
Hey, Bill, a couple things.
Sure.
I think your question on internet access is a good one. I think we're waiting on some guidance on that, and then I think from that perspective, it may depend on it actually may depend on the type of company and what the internet access is doing. We have some companies that are doing a lot of hosting in relation to their business, and it's a major expense in their P&L. But I do think it's one of those questions. The other question, Bill, I wanted to throw out there is there's a question on if capital lease interest is eligible for forgiveness. It's a great question. I don't think we've seen it before, but I think you can make an argument, because the capital lease tends to be a debt obligation relating to the purchase of an equipment, that it may actually be eligible if it meets the other qualifications as to when it was in place and things like that. I didn't know if you had an opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, really nothing beyond your point there, Frank. Again, it's an area that although the SBA did issue some guidance, and there's been a number of items that have been published over the last few days, I haven't seen that issue addressed.
Another area, Bill, to add as far as nonprofits, we've talked about it a little bit, but there hasn't been guidance, as you said, was the unemployment. So if a non-for-profit is choosing to not pay that SUTA payroll tax, where other companies are paying that tax, that would be an allowable payroll cost. If you're using the unemployment trust and you're making payments to the unemployment trust, there's not a lot of guidance on whether those expenses would be an allowable expense. It's something that you would need to talk to your bank about, and hopefully there's also going to be additional guidance coming down.
Yeah, it's a great point, Amber. You and I spoke of that late last week, and my initial thought there is that because that's and we're going to get into it right now about forgivable payroll costs, but because those costs are specifically enumerated, absent some guidance that kind of that bridges that gap between the trust fund payments and the actual tax, I think you'd have an uphill climb on that, unless something comes out. So moving on, forgivable payroll costs. So again, a lot of you folks are aware of this, but just understand you've got your salary and wages, commission, and other similar compensation. That all gets that piece of it gets capped at $100,000. And then you add in your other types of costs that can exceed the $100,000. So you've got your paid sick leave and medical leave. Just understand that that there was the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, which mandated sick and family medical leave. And so companies that were mandated to pay that were getting refundable tax credits through that program. And that came in, I want to say like mid-March. And if you are paying that leave, right, they're mandating that you make the payment to those folks, but you're also getting a refundable tax credit. So they're not going to allow you to double dip there. And then your group health benefits and your retirement benefits, the employer side of those matches, and then you've got your state and local taxes. And that's, to your point, to your question there, Amber, I think that's my read on it. Again, it's my read is I think they're gonna view that they're gonna view that strictly and not liberally. But we'll wait guidance and see where that goes. The employer federal employment taxes. So, we're past that point where that was clearly revised in the SBA guidance, but we do have a number of clients that did apply prior to that guidance coming out, and they included those costs. And at that point, you could make a legal argument based on the way the CARES Act was drafted and enacted into law on March 27th that could be an eligible cost. The fact pattern has come up for a number of folks is that you may have been approved utilizing those calculations and utilizing those amounts. Can you now use them in your forgiveness amount after the fact that guidance has been issued saying that you couldn't use those amounts in your application in the first place, when the guidance basically said if you had applied using the updated guidance, especially on this matter, that you didn't have to go back and amend your return. I don't have an answer for that yet. I wish we did. But just keep that in mind that you may, if you did use that to the employer FICA taxes, if you did use that for your loan application and were approved on those amounts, just be aware that there may be, those are clearly not eligible now and may not be eligible for forgiveness. So again, we're waiting some additional guidance on that. And I most folks know this compensation, although the SBA did issue some guidance on employees that are not considered residents of the U.S. They revert you back to the Internal Revenue Code Regulation 121. But if you have folks that are outside the U.S. That you're paying, that they're not included in your forgivable payroll costs.
Hey, Bill.
Yep.
Question came up regarding the fact that we said you can't use the proceeds to expand payroll. Would providing a bonus to some staff be considered expanding payroll? That's the basic bonus question that we continue to get. I'm not sure the guidance is in there yet, and obviously it is a major point of question for most companies we're dealing with. Obviously, you have the $100,000 cap, but if there are bonuses given, I think it comes down to history. If you normally give employee bonuses during periods of time, if you're not doing it in a manner just to utilize the funds for forgiveness, and you're doing it consistent with other operating activities that if you historically can justify, you probably have some aspect of support in that regard. But I think this is case by case basis. You agree, Bill?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And we're going to get into this. I know we've already gotten some questions on cash versus accrual. But yeah, I agree. It's going to be facts and circumstances driven. So if you are, and one other point, so, as most folks know, your loan was based on 2.5 times your payroll, your monthly average payroll, but then you're only given effectively 8 weeks to spend it. What we've seen as we've been talking to a lot of clients is that they're gonna have a hard time spending the full amount. because you're, especially unless they have significant rent payments or significant utility payments, because they're comparing 10 or 11 weeks, and they're only given 8 weeks to spend it. So the questions come up, okay, well, we're only gonna be able to spend 80% of the loan amount at our current levels. Can we go in and bonus folks so that we can maximize that? And again, I'll kind of go back to your point there, Frank. I think if you can demonstrate that it's part of your your normal bonus structure, the timing is accurate, or if it's for amounts that were accrued, you might have an argument. But I wouldn't go out and just try and spend every dollar you have through bonuses that aren't part of your normal process just to make that happen.
Bill, one of these questions may have come up because a lot of the nonprofits that are in the social service arena are those essential employees that are putting themselves at risk continuing working on their mission. So they're at group homes, they're working more overtime, those sort of things. So while that's not necessarily in the history of their organization, because this is something new, could they potentially document that it's warranted because they're putting themselves in a position that they wouldn't normally have put themselves in, them being the employees? Yeah.
I mean, 2 points on that. One is I think that there's going to be, and again, an opinion here, but I certainly think that there's going to be some leeway provided by the SBA and the Treasury Department on those types of businesses that are providing those types of absolutely critical and necessary services to get us, that go way beyond any kind of PPP application. But also, although it's not meant to expand operations, I mean, this is not expanding an operation. I mean, it might be increased operations because of where you were in February, but I wouldn't define that as expanding your operations. This is maintaining your current operations, which require these necessary services. I don't know if I answered your question there, Amber.
You did. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Bill, one more question. Health insurance premiums, including the cost of, do they include the cost of dental insurance premiums? I thought we said we did, but I wanted to clarify with you on that.
Yeah, I didn't see anything. Excluding that.
Correct.
Or excluding vision. I think it all rolls up into your health care.
Yep. And then the other question, are health insurance premiums a forgivable expense?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, our health insurance premiums a forgivable expense? Yes.
Yep. The employer piece of it. Okay, so understand the law. So we're getting into this. You've received your funds. You're getting into this next phase here. Note that it's an 8-week period, and so in our first round of discussions with clients, it was very easy to say, hey, we got our funds on April 15th, so we've got till June 15th to spend it. And unless you're super knowledgeable about the calendar, you might miss the fact that that's not really 8 weeks, right? So you really have to, if you got your money on a Wednesday, April 15th, you need to count out 8 Wednesdays, which I think is going to bring you back, 4 or 5 days off the calendar. So you might be looking at like June 10th or June 11th, somewhere in that time frame. But it's 8 weeks, right? And until something comes out that says it's not 8 weeks, it's 8 weeks. And it's from the date that the first disbursement of the funds. So you may have gotten an approval from your bank on one day, you may have gotten an SBA documentation letter on another day, and then you need to look at when did the loans actually hit my bank account. That is the start date for your 8-week period. Second bullet there, the amounts incurred and payments made. That's right from the CARES Act. So it's for amounts incurred and payments, the sum of amounts incurred and payments made during the 8-week period. So you can see what I've provided there in the bullet, but obviously this brings about the question of are we using a cash basis here, or are we using an accrual basis? And this is relevant for any fact pattern, but especially relevant for a fact pattern where you got your first disbursement in and about payday. If you pay, twice a month, if you got something around the 16th or the 15th or the 14th, and then where that date falls on the end of the 8-week cycle, I'll say that the CARES Act opens the door with regard to the payroll costs, that it's potentially either concept, obviously not double dipping. And then kind of looking back through the CARES Act and the specific language that they use when they talk about forgivable costs, they talk about the sum of amounts incurred and payments made, and then they just say payroll costs. Well, that's A. B is payments made for rent, payments made for utilities. So our position right now, at least, is that the rent utilities could likely be read to be on a cash basis, and the payroll could be either. Frank, I don't know if you want to comment, or Amber, you want to comment. I know Frank, you and I have had some fact patterns that we've gone through with some clients that had that, that payroll day was kind of butting right up against their disbursement date. Yeah,
Bill, sorry, I was answering questions, but I think the overall approach we've told people is include it in the beginning with the detailed backup supporting what you include in the beginning of the your first payroll run. If it only includes a certain number of days and you're including the entire payroll run in within the calculated amount, make sure you do it in a level of detail that can easily be adjusted if new guidance comes out. And then we're also obviously asking people to predict out 8 weeks with their payroll, when the payroll gets paid, to ensure that they're treating it consistently on the back end as they would on the front end. And if they're doing an accrual basis, be consistent on both sides of the 8 weeks, as well as make sure you're documenting it in a manner that can be adjusted if new guidance comes out, so you don't have to go back and redo everything. You're going to have, hopefully, guidance come out on forgiveness over the next couple of weeks that you should be able to document in a way your support, so that you could easily manipulate it and recalculate amounts under the forgiveness calculations as they get adjusted.
Yeah, so flexibility is clearly what we're advising. Hey, Amber, I don't know if you want to comment quickly on the, and for nonprofits, right? I mean, so one of the concepts that we've been talking to our clients about is that if you are a cash basis taxpayer or an accrual basis taxpayer, although it hasn't been issued as any kind of guidance, and I'm not saying that it is, but I could see that potentially being a road that the SBA takes in looking at how do you file your tax returns, and if it's on an accrual basis, they may bring out some guidance that kind of brings taxpayers down that road versus a cash basis taxpayer. From a nonprofit perspective, is that a relevant concept that folks should be aware of, Amber?
It is very similar concept. So on the 990, it is asking whether you're a cash basis tax, providing information on a tax basis or an accrual basis. So it would be the same answer for both.
Okay. Okay, and again, there's no official guidance there. It's just kind of, as we've been awaiting this. I mean, we've been awaiting this. There's been, like I said, Friday to Sunday was kind of a hot day for certain questions answered by the SBA, but they keep promising specific guidance on loan forgiveness, and we're still kind of awaiting, that bigger piece of guidance that's really going to walk through some of these other concepts that we've been talking about. But anyway, moving on. So this is a huge slide. If you only have time to look at one of the slides that we send over to you, I would highly recommend spending the most time on this slide. So understanding the forgiveness calculation. Right, so your starting point, the first bullet there, is just the amount that you spend. If you got a loan for $1 million, and that's based on 2.5 times a payroll, but you can only, as you model that out, you may only be able to spend, especially if you've had some reductions in headcount or reductions in hours, you should only be able to spend about 75 to 80% of it. Again, assuming that there's not significant rent costs or significant utility costs at play here. But whatever you spend, if you got a loan for $1 million, but you spend, $850,000 of it, that's the starting point of forgiveness. The additional $150,000 in that example is going to be part of your loan, and that'll be required to be paid back. There's no prepayment penalty. So you can prepay it all back, or you can keep the balance as a note for the remainder of the 2-year period and pay it off as the loan at 1% interest. But that's your starting point. Then there's a number of different ways that loan forgiveness, and I'll stay with that same example. You spent, $850, or you spent $850,000, but there's a number of different ways that can be reduced. And so the first is a reduction of full-time employees, and we're going to go into some detail on how the SBA, at least in the past, has included their full-time equivalent employees. I think that's going to be where they land with regard to the PPP loan, but again, we're awaiting some guidance. So you're going to look at from the date the loan was dispersed. You're going to look at how many full-time equivalent employees, not full-time employees, but full-time equivalent employees you had during that 8-week period on an average basis. That's going to become your numerator, and then your denominator is going to be one of two options, right? So you've got the first option is the full-time equivalent employees from February 15th to June 30th of 2019. And your second option is January 1st to February 29th of 2020. You're obviously going to want to select the lower of those two numbers, because you're going to apply that quotient to your loan forgiveness starting point, which in our example was $850,000. So as you go through that, right, you're going to say, okay, I've got 100 employees in my numerator, I've got 90 employees in my numerator, and I've got 100 employees in my denominator. You're going to take that quotient, that 90%, and you're going to apply that to the loan forgiveness amount that we started with, and that's going to be how much they're going to forgive. And we're going to get into ways to restore that quotient calculation, because there's an impact of rehires that we're going to discuss. But that's one area of loan forgiveness reduction. Second area of loan forgiveness reduction, and I keep the two prongs separated, but you've got your reduction based on FTEs, and then you've got your reduction based on salary. So if you reduce any single employee's salary by more than 25% during the 8-week period as compared to the first quarter of 2020, then that amount that you reduce their salary by is going to reduce your loan amount. And when they look at that, the CARES Act says, and that's limited to folks that made $100,000 in 2019 on any single pay period on an annualized basis. So you need to be cognizant of that. So if you had an employee that made $105,000 during the year, then you can arguably, at least as stated under the CARES Act and under the relevant guidance, you could reduce their salary by, $40,000 and have no reduction to your loan forgiveness based on this criteria. If that same employee made $99,000 in 2019 or on any annualized pay period stub, then you need to be cognizant of this. Because any reduction over that 25% as compared to the quarter could put you into this bucket. And one of the fact patterns that we've seen is you may have somebody who made $60,000 in 2019, but they received a bonus in December, or they received a bonus in February, and that bonus that hit their pay stub would have put them over the $100,000 on an annualized basis. Again, that's the exact language of the CARES Act. There may be something that comes out that kind of cures that a little bit, but for that employee, you could reduce their salary by any amount, and it won't get reduced under this criteria for loan forgiveness reduction. Sorry, you guys can't hear that.
Hey, Bill.
Yep.
Use question. A lot of question in regards to the reductions. Are they compounding or are they either or? So there's a lot of questions as to, can you get reduced by more than one of the calculations? So therefore, is it kind of compounding on each other, or is it, yeah, you get reduced by FTEs or you get reduced by salaries? I know you and I debated this, so I figured I'd throw it out to you to kind of comment on, and I think the answer is we're not sure right now, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll say, yeah, I'll say we're not sure on one element. My view is that it's compounding. So if you had, in our example there, if you had, if your quotient was 90 over 100, then that's going to be your first reduction in loan forgiveness. And then you go through your 8-week period and you go through your wage reduction and you reduced 5 employees that were all made under $100,000 in 2019, and you reduced their salary by more than 25% as compared to Q1. And that when you look at that, again, that kind of gives you more wiggle room than 25% because you're comparing a quarter to 8 weeks. So it really kind of gives you like that 40%. It's as kind of a estimate amount. But if you reduce those 5 employees and it's more than what you're allowed to reduce their salary by, and let's say that additional reduction calculation equates to another $15,000, then my view is that you're going to have a second piece of reduction, right? So you're going to have the 90% applied to the 850, and then you're going to have a second amount that's going to reduce that even more. The question I think that you and I, Frank, we're talking about, and I think we got some clarity on this, is what if you eliminated an employee, and so now they're going to go out, they're going to go into your FTE reduction, but could that also be viewed as reducing their salary from 100 down to 0, and could you get kind of whipsawed on that and get a double reduction on that? That I believe would not happen because they're no longer an employee as defined under the CARES Act, and that salary reduction would not be a calculation that you'd have to concern yourself. So if you have that situation, I think it's either or.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of really good questions coming in regards to this, and we always have them. There's a lot of detail here that's hard to get into in the time frame that we have. So, one of the other questions is, listen, due to a contract or due to the fact that the employee found a different job that they thought was better, they left on their own. Does that get adjusted out of my forgiveness calc? It's a great question. Quite honestly, we don't know the answer to that, and we're dealing with that even individually on our own, where people may want to leave based upon finding a different employment option that they consider better. We did not release them or terminate them in any way, shape, or form. We're assuming that those are going to be treated negatively against us in the employee reduction concept, because nothing else has come out to tell us differently in regards to whether an employee left on their own, left under a contract expiring, or just was terminated due to lack of work. There is no guidance in that regard, so you have to assume that unless guidance comes out, that those reductions are going to be treated negatively against the FTE count. Bill, just a time check, and Amber, a time check, 11:43. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks, Frank. Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with that point, Frank. And that I think as it's written right now, I think if you have somebody that leaves on their own will, under their that's going to impact you negatively. And I don't know if there's any other way to read that. Other than to say that the SBA may rectify that situation, but I would not advise anyone, as of today, to think that situation is not going to have a negative impact on their loan forgiveness. And then one other point, and I don't see it in our bullet here, but there's also the original CARES Act did not have any kind of restrictions on the percentage of loan proceeds that had to get allocated to various costs. Subsequent to the CARES Act and the SBA guidance, I think it was in the first round, they basically say that no more than 25% of your forgivable costs can be related to non-payroll costs. And I know, Frank, you and I debated that, and there's actually been some pretty significant debate out in the legal community and other CPA firms as to, does that mean that that only 25% of your costs can be non-payroll costs, or does that require that 75% of your costs must be payroll costs? And although it doesn't seem like it's a significant difference in the way you phrase that, it can be in that, could the SBA come in and say, hey, you didn't spend at least 75% of the proceeds, and they are pretty clear that they want that to go to payroll costs, but you didn't spend 75% of the proceeds on payroll costs, therefore we're not going to forgive any of the loan. That's a lot different than, hey, we spent 30% of the loan proceeds on rent and utilities and spent 70% of the loan proceeds on payroll costs, and therefore we're going to have, that 5% delta not forgiven. That seems like a pretty reasonable interpretation. And if you look through the guidance, you could kind of read it both ways based on which page of the 31-page guidance you're reading. But I would just tell folks that's another loan forgiveness criteria. And before we send these slides out, I'll add that bullet in because I thought I had it in there. But that's something that folks need to be aware of. That
hey, Bill, there's a question that talks about, what is being defined as an FTE, and we referenced the fact the SBA had some guidance on this that we were assuming is going to apply, and they wanted to make sure we didn't miss that point in the presentation. Does that come up now, or is that a later?
It's coming up. Let me just get through these last two bullets. So just the impact of rehire. So if you have a reduction in your full-time equivalent employees, that occurred because of an event that happened between February 15th of 2020 and April 26th, which was yesterday. You lost somebody. So you lost the person who asked the question about somebody left on their own accord. It happens in that window, and now you've got a reduction in FTEs. You have the ability to cure that if you bring back that full-time equivalent, not the specific person, but bring back the full-time equivalent by June 30th. And that's the way the letter of the law reads right now. So if you lost somebody, you could bring somebody, arguably you could bring somebody back on June 30th. I wouldn't do it on June 30th. I'd at least give yourself June 29th. And you brought that back, and it basically what it does is it replaces the reduction in your numerator. And the same concept goes for the reduction in salary. You reduce somebody's salary between that reduction occurred between those two dates, February 15th and April 26th. You can cure that by bringing their salary back up to their February 15th standard by June 30th of 2020. And if you do that, it's kind of like it's restoring those two reduction criteria. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so here we go. So this is the full-time equivalent employees. I'll go through some of the kind of what's out there, and then Amber, maybe you can kind of give some more kind of fact-specific scenarios that you see in your nonprofit client base. But the CARES Act uses the term full-time equivalent employee and then doesn't define it, which is fantastic. And obviously, everything we discussed, a very centralized point with regard to PPP forgiveness calculations. There is guidance that the SBA did publish back in, I think it was 2018, where they do go through a definition of full-time employee and full-time equivalent employee. And keep in mind the CARES Act uses full-time equivalent employee. And so the way that they present that issue is if you have anyone that's working on average of over 30 hours, then they become a full-time employee. They're considered a full-time employee, and they go into the count. Anyone that's working less than 30 hours on average would be considered a non-full-time employee, and then they get into this equivalency calculation. And based on the way the 18 guidance, it looks like it's an aggregation concept. So you have, and the example they give you is a nice, neat, and pretty example. But if you had, two employees that worked 15 hours, they would equate, because your magic number is 30, they would equate to one full-time equivalent employee. The question that we were talking about, I think on Saturday, was, well, what if you had, you had 3 employees, and they worked not 15 hours, but they worked 20 hours apiece? Would that be 2 employees? My understanding is that you would aggregate all your employees that don't work 30 hours, find out what your hours are, and then divide by 120, and that would give you your full-time equivalents. Amber, you want to comment just kind of on the fact patterns you see in your nonprofits?
Yep, I think A big issue that people will fall under now is if their programs are currently not running, right? So they are paying their employees exactly what the PPP's purpose is, to keep them employed, but they're not actually working those hours. So it's how many hours you're paying your employees for is the same as hours worked.
Yeah, I mean, this old 2018 guidance just uses the term hours worked, but it's pretty difficult to define that in the world we live in today, with folks either working, not working, being employed, working from home. I believe they're going to go to an hours employed versus an hours worked concept, because it's in line with the intent of the law. The intent of the law is to keep people out of the unemployment line, and so they want businesses, including nonprofits, to try and do what they can to retain their employees and keep them on the payroll, to some degree, regardless of whether that work's available. I mean, that the original intent was to basically provide the relief only to those companies. I think that was their original intent. But obviously that the PPP program took on a much broader group of companies.
Okay. And then one last piece to add to that is on the opposite spectrum, more employees are working more overtime than they naturally would. That does not affect their full-time equivalent calculation. So if they have less employees, but the same amount of hours are being filled, that does not change the calculation.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm going back to the old SBA guidance, which I don't see why they would change that. I don't think, other than maybe defining working versus employed, which is the point you brought up, Amber. But once you get an employee to over 30 hours, then that whether they work 30, 40, 80, 100, that's just one full-time equivalent. You aggregate the folks that are working or employed less.
Thank you.
Yep. So key dates, we've talked a lot about these, but so the first couple there, the February 15th to June 30th and the January 1 to February 29th of 2020, those are your key denominator dates for that FTE quotient that you're going to apply to the amount that you've spent, basically, because that's your starting point for loan forgiveness. So, going through and like Frank mentioned, we're doing the same analysis for our own company, is just understanding your FTE count through in those two dates is so critical to understanding what your FTE count, that in line with your FTE count for the next 8 weeks is what's going to drive that loan forgiveness calculation. So, advise getting that into a spreadsheet and understanding how to calculate those numbers and what your number comes out to, because especially I would think, Amber, in the nonprofit world, there may be a number of nonprofits that have a lot of part-timers. So understanding that calculation, you could have a swing of a couple employees here or there, and that could can make or break your loan forgiveness in terms of getting 100% of it forgiven or getting only 80% of it forgiven. Go ahead.
Nope, I was just going to confirm with what you're saying. Yes, many of them are working with the part-time employees.
Yeah. February 15th is a key date, because that's that, and then April 26th. Those are your two windows where if you had a reduction in FTE count and or a reduction in salary, if it happens between those dates, then you have the ability to cure it on June 30th, which is our next date. If you lost somebody on April 27th, April 28th as an FTE count, under the Act, you can't cure your FTE loan forgiveness quotient calculation other than to hire somebody back into that position as soon as you possibly can to keep your average number higher. You're not eligible for that June 30th. Let's catch them all up at the end of June and bring that FTE count back. So just keep that in mind as you're making your decisions on employment status and the numbers that you're dealing with. Disbursement date, that varies obviously, and the end of the 8 week varies, and we talked about the importance of understanding your start date and your end date. Yeah, we went through a lot of these points. This is kind of in our planning section, but yeah, we discussed the first couple bullets there and your 8-week plan. Understanding when your rent obligations and your payment dates. Second to last bullet there, we've run into this situation of folks that are their 8-week period is maybe on June, what do we say, June 12th in our example, when their 8-week period ends on June 8th, June 10th. While we don't advise expanding payroll, you may want to establish a pay date that falls within your 8-week window.
All right. And Bill, I don't think you've mentioned this yet, that when it comes in to measure your 8-week period, it's don't use dates, but go by if you receive it on the Tuesday, count 8 Tuesdays down. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, and then we talked about cash versus accrual, and we're anxiously awaiting more guidance. Okay, so kind of we're in our planning. So we strategize and model. I think that as you're starting here or awaiting your funds, understand. I would advise reaching out to your CPA firm or going through your internal calculations with your accounting group and understanding what is going to be your spend in the next 8 weeks. What happened to your payroll? What happened to your employees? Has there been any material changes? Are there any potential adds or subtractions that may be coming down the pike? We got a loan for $1 million, but how much are we actually going to be able to spend? Keeping in mind that that anyone that made over $100,000, right? The most that you're going to be able to use the PPP funds to to pay that person's salary is, the number works out to $15,384.
Right, Bill, I would treat this very much like those that are receiving grant funds, right? So when you apply to your grant funds, you budget out how you're going to spend those funds and you send it to the grantor. Treat this very similar, and that you'll have a plan exactly on how you're going to spend the funds, and that's going to be your best bet to be able to have it forgiven because you've planned in advance. You'll know when your payment dates are. It's very similar to grants in the fact that you have to spend the money by a certain date, and it's the same concept with this.
Yep. Yeah, and we get into, I think, in one of the upcoming slides regarding documentation. But yeah, it's critical. It's critical to understand your what you got and your needs, and separating that. Well, we've gotten the question a lot. I think it's coming up, but we've gotten the question a lot about what do we do? We've got an existing bank account, and now we've got these PPP loan proceeds. What do we do with them? Where do we put them? Do we put them? Do we establish a separate bank account? What if I use a different bank if I've got a banking relationship, but I use a different bank for the PPP loan? What do I keep those funds in a separate bank account? What if I use the same bank? How do I separate those funds for purposes of PPP? And am I required to do that? And I'll give the legal position, I guess, from where the CARES Act states and the guidance states right now, and maybe you guys, Frank and Amber, can comment on this a little bit. But right now there's nothing in the guidance that specifically provides that the PPP funds must be put into a separate bank account. However, again, going back to the point we made early on, is I think this is going to be heavily reviewed, potentially heavily audited, and so I think it would be wise business practice to, if not to fully separate them in a separate bank account, at a minimum, use your existing accounting software to put them into kind of an isolated tracking mechanism, or isolated, not account, but an isolated area where you're showing that the funds are, that here's your total PPP funds, and that you're maybe transferring funds from your PPP available funds and transferring them into another account, which may be paying payroll or other items. I don't know if Amber or Frank, you guys have a comment on that?
Yeah, you can prepare yourself similar to those have gone through a single audit compliance audit. I would prepare yourself the same way. So if you don't want to set up a separate bank account, if you are using QuickBooks, separate create a separate class in QuickBooks to track the expenditures that go against PPP. If you're not using QuickBooks and you're using a different accounting software, you can set up a cost center. However you're tracking your program expenses, track PPP as a separate program to keep those expenditures separate from your other expenses. It's going to get down to it in another slide, but it's very similar to, it's kind of an unknown factor right now. If you're receiving grant fundings, can I use the same expenditure to cover my grant expenditures as I do PPP? Or will it be double counting it? In other words, funding the same expense twice. And the answer right now is really unknown. Definitely want to get ahead of this before the end of your year, especially if your year end is June 30th. What we're suggesting at this point is reaching out to your grantors and finding out what is their stance on it. A lot of them have already put guidance onto their own websites, more specifically state than federal, what I've found so far. But you want to make sure that you're keeping your expenditures separate for granting purposes, PPP expenditures, and then your other contribution funds that are covering those expenses. So nothing's necessarily changing if you're keeping track of your expenses by program, except you're adding an additional program to it.
Nothing to add here, Bill. I think just a time check. We are at noon, understanding people may have limitations. If we want to continue to move on, I've moved the slide forward, and I'm not sure how many more we have, but for those of you who can maintain and stay on the webinar, that's great. We're going to continue to go, and if you've got to jump off, we'll get you the slides, and please reach out if you have any questions. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Frank. Yeah, I would say we got about another 5 or 10 minutes to go here. So the last bullet there, the good faith certifications, and I think the next slide, Amber, is the point that you just discussed. And so I imagine that's going to be, extremely relevant for companies that only receive grant funding, still relevant, but maybe at a lesser degree to companies that have, 50% of their revenue coming from grants. If there's a way to, separately allocate those items so that the PPP is covering, non-grant funded compensation. But anyway, I don't want to steal your thunder on that. But the last bullet, the good faith certification. So this is where the SBA, it's something that we've discussed in all of our prior webinars. Certainly something that we've tried to make folks aware of. But as you look at the loan forgiveness, there's, you look at the calculation. There's nothing in the specific calculation that looks at grant revenue, revenue versus expenses, and has any kind of clawback with regard to some sort of a mathematical calculation. But there were multiple certifications that you made when you applied for the loan, and the one that they're gonna I think that they're gonna utilize as they start to audit these things is, did the uncertain economic environment make the loan necessary? And I think most folks can certainly certify to that, and that the loan was going to be used to maintain, the loan was necessary to maintain and maintain operations and retain payroll. That's kind of where the SBA went on Friday. They published an FAQ. It's question 31, which the question doesn't necessarily relate to nonprofits because it doesn't relate to a lot of companies that had SBA loans, because it discusses businesses that are owned by large companies. That's the question. The answer then kind of splinters into a lot of different directions, but basically I think they're putting folks on notice that they're going to take a look at that, and they're going to look to see whether the loan was actually necessary and whether whether you met your good faith certification. That's a frequently asked question piece of guidance, which is not official. The SBA publishes what they call interim rules. Those then become finalized and published in the Federal Register. And when they took that FAQ and they put it into their interim rule, they really backed off. They didn't mention anything about large companies, and they backed off some of the liquidity provisions that were in the FAQ, and basically just said that they're giving folks a safe harbor of May 7th if they want to give back the money based on the necessity of the funds. So again, A little unclear where the SBA is going with that. I would think at some point they're going to use those certifications to try and, understand what the needs were, and then look at each company's facts and circumstances separate. Okay, I'm gonna punt this over to you, Amber. This is kind of your bailiwick. I know you mentioned a few of these concepts already.
Yes, so we've already talked about it somewhat, making sure that we're not double counting our expenditures for grants that you have received for specific expenditures versus the PPP. Now, I want to be clear that there really hasn't been guidance from SBA on this matter directly, nor have all of the departments commented on it for the grantor's purposes as well. However, when you read your contracts, the contracts generally say that you can only use the expenditures once, meaning if you have a DMIS contract and a DSS contract, those two departments don't want to pay for the same expense. I could envision that they wouldn't want to pay something that PPP is also covering. So again, if you have an organization that's half run by grants and half run by contributions, you're okay because the PPP can support the contribution portion. If your organization funded by all grants, another area that you'll want to look at is if your programs are currently closed and you're receiving the PPP to keep your employees engaged and employed, is that payroll that you're paying your employees to essentially not work even an allowable expense under those grants and contracts? So even if you can double count them, make sure it's still an allowable expense under your grant. So two concepts to really think about there. And again, you probably want to get a grasp on this sooner rather than later if you're a June year end, knowing if you may have to pay some of your grant back if it's an unallowable expenditure or double counting of an expenditure. The other question that has come up, because most of your nonprofits are June 30 year ends, is the subsequent event matter of when is my loan going to be forgivable and when can I bring that loan into income, right? So right now, when you get granted your PPP, it's going to be a loan on your balance sheet or on your statement of financial position. You're going to have a debt balance. Say you've received your funds the beginning of May or the end of April, your 8-week period is going to be over before your year end, right? Before June 30. However, there is an application process to get forgiven. So it's not like you just meet the expenditures, you've estimated, and you know what your forgiveness is. There is an application process. So what we are suggesting is that you're not going to be able to bring this loan into income until the approval process has been finalized for your forgiveness of the loan. So at June 30, most likely, most of you won't be able to recognize any of that to income. So you will have the expenditures in your June 30, 2020 year, but the income will show up in June 30, 2021. The other matter that we've kind of briefly discussed on the for-profit side is this income that is being brought in is not going to be taxable. There isn't reasons to believe at this point that as a nonprofit that forgiveness is going to be taxable because it's not, not directly related to your mission, right? If you get income that's outside of your scope of your mission, you have to pay or analyze your unrelated business income. We're under the current opinion that income would still be not taxable to nonprofits, but again, there's very little guidance at this point on how that would be treated. But for most of you, that's going to be a fiscal year 2021 item. Okay. For the PPP documentation, very similar to what I had mentioned earlier, for those of you that have gone through the single audit process, I would prepare yourselves the same way to be audited by, it's not said if the SBA is going to contract like auditing firms to audit them, or if SBA is going to do it themselves, or if it's going to be the banks, but I would just prepare yourselves to be audited at a separate time. So we did mention you can keep the funding in a separate account to keep the tracking a little bit clearer, but that is not a required step. And just keeping that documentation for all of your eligible expenses, making a plan at the beginning of this, as we mentioned, and then documenting along the way of how those fundings have been spent. I went through that slide very quickly, but just knowing that it's 10 after 12 already. Making sure that you retain all of your documentation, keeping all of your payroll records, your 941s, your health insurance premiums. Really, I would just suggest that once you have your plan in place of how you're going to spend those PPP funds, then just keep track of how you've met each of that plan along the way, and then keep that documentation. So you're creating that audit trail. Okay, and these are just additional suggested records to retain.
Yeah, those last 3 slides that we had out there, though, that used to be 1 slide, and it was kind of more of the objective documentation that was either published in guidance or just kind of practical that you would keep to support your calculations. That, and when I broke it out, that ends up being the last 2 slides in the documentation. The first slide is really a response to what came out on Friday, and just making sure that as you're going through that you're understanding your needs and what's necessary, and just making sure that as you go through the process, you're keeping that trail with regard to your pre-COVID and your post-COVID activity, so that if the SBA ever challenged the certifications, you've got a good story to tell. So that's really,
Bill, Amber, just time check. It is, listen, we still have 34 people on the call, so it's about just after 10 past, almost 12 past. I just want to thank you both. The detail and the depth of what we're doing is really hard to get into an hour, and I think you both did a great job of trying to touch on some key points. I think, this slide has Amber's contact information for all of you not-for-profits. Please reach out to Amber. She is a hidden gem, and she is one of a well-known expert in the industry, and she'd be happy to address any concerns you have, and obviously we can put you in contact with Bill as well on specific PPP related questions. We also have our website that's listed here for those of you who have the ability. Please go in and check frequently on documentation that we're evaluating and guidance that we're putting out. It's really a matter of the task force spending a lot of time evaluating new guidance that's come out and trying to get it out to our client base. We have about 19 questions, guys, that we didn't answer. Some of them I think we addressed verbally, and I would say at this point we're going to do what we normally do. We'll go through the questions the best we can, get a Q&A out to those of you who participated, and we'll do our best to get that out. As well as getting access to the slides that we've presented today, and a recording of the event, which I believe will also be made available to participants today as well. Amber, Bill, I'll give you an opportunity. Is there anything else you want to kind of drop into the audience at this point, or are we good to call it a day?
I just have, I apologize. It's hard to scroll through the questions when you're talking, but I just did a quick scroll, and one of the questions that came up is the cash basis and the accrual. I just want to clarify the statements that we made. Right now, I would say there's uncertainty as to the basis. I made a statement as to I could see potentially the government looking at your tax basis and utilizing that, but that's clearly not any specific guidance that's been provided by the SBA. The CARES Act specifically provides that it's for the sum of amounts incurred and payments made, and you can read that a multitude of different ways. And to get to one of Frank's points earlier is, as we stand on April 27th, you probably want to look at being flexible with the way that you're tracking everything, and for payroll, you may want to look at the payments made at this point and just have the flexibility to move to an accrual basis if you need to. And as soon as that guidance gets issued, which we expect, I expected it last week, we'll certainly update everyone on an official position that the SBA is taking on what basis to use.
Nope, I just want to say thank you for everyone for joining us and sticking with us past 15-minute time mark. As more information becomes available regarding grant expenditures versus PPP expenditures, I will be sure to get that information out to everyone because I think that's going to be a key factor going forward for a lot of organizations. Otherwise, have a good day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.